This is Dr. Ben White with the Rational Wellness Podcast, bringing you the cutting edge information on health and nutrition from the latest scientific research and by interviewing the top experts in the field. Please subscribe to the Rational Wellness Podcast on iTunes and YouTube, and sign up for my free ebook on my website by going to drwhites.com. Let's get started on your road to better health. Hello, Rational Wellness Podcasters. Thank you so much for joining me again today. For those of you who enjoy listening to the Rational Wellness Podcast, please go to iTunes and give us a ratings and review. That way more people can find out about the Rational Wellness Podcast. And for those of you who only listen on your phone with the audio version, just want to let you know that there is a video version. If you go to the YouTube page, the White's Chiro YouTube page, there are additional videos that are not on the audio version. So you might want to check that out and subscribe. So today we're going to talk about how to improve your skin with Jennifer Fugo and what to do about all these skin conditions that so many of us are dealing with. Jennifer Fugo is a clinical nutritionist with a focus on skin and gut problems. She has a master's in human nutrition, and she's an Amazon best-selling author of The Savvy Gluten-Free Shopper, How to Eat Healthy Without Breaking the Bank. Don't go to Whole Foods. No, just kidding. And the host of the Healthy Skin Show. Jennifer, thank you so much for joining me today.
Well, thank you so much for having me. I really appreciate it.
Good. So how did you get interested in the nutrition field? Tell us a little bit about your personal journey.
Ooh, well, I got sick. I think that's one of the commonalities for most people is you get sick and you end up like thinking there's got to be something else out there.
Yeah.
I had gut issues for probably over 15 years since I was a kid, and rashes, brain fog, really bad fatigue in my early 20s. And it got to the point where I was told by doctors nothing was wrong, found a nutritionist, and she's like, hey, I think you have some issues here. And we determined that I had food sensitivities to things like gluten, dairy, eggs, the cruciferous family, the cashew family. And I had no idea what a food sensitivity was, what that meant. I had no clue. I just thought that like having chronic diarrhea and horrific smelling gas was normal. And so I got into nutrition that way because I came to realize that there was this whole other side of nutrition and helping people improve the quality of their daily life by changing food and whatnot. But eventually I came to realize that there's only so much you could do with food. There are some things that go above and beyond what we can oftentimes do in the kitchen. It's not to put that down. Food is certainly medicine, but there's a lot of other things that I found to be helpful because the clients that I was dealing with were chronically ill and had autoimmune disease and whatnot. And so I went back for a master's in clinical nutrition at the University of Bridgeport, finished that up a couple years ago. And actually, so this sort of leads into my story of how I ended up interested in skin issues. My final year of my master's program, I developed dyshidrotic eczema on my hands. And so I got to the point where it was so flared that I was wearing blue gloves that I would buy, these like disposable gloves that I could get at Home Depot just to protect my hands because I couldn't even run them underwater. It burned so badly. And I tried topical steroids. I went to the dermatologist and they're just like, I don't know, like just use a steroid cream and put some Vaseline on top to keep the moisture in. And, you just have to learn to live with it.
Yeah, I remember Woody Allen sketch where he said, dermatologists are dealing with 5,000 different skin conditions and they only have 4 creams. So
that's a good way to put it. And that's kind of what it feels like. Their toolbox is incredibly limited. I said, look, I'm gluten-free, dairy-free, egg-free. Like I had been that for years, eating a more, not restrictive. I didn't consider it restrictive, but I had these restrictions in my diet. So it wasn't like I had to then take them out. I was already like that. And I had developed this condition. And a lot of it had to do with the sheer amount of stress that I was under at the time. And so anyway, at the point where I hit rock bottom, my husband had said to me, well, what would you do if somebody came to you and said, could you help me with this? And I was like, I don't know. I never thought of it, and started doing research and came to discover that there really weren't good resources out there. A lot of the information was super generalized, or it didn't really work after I tried it. And so I just started playing around. I thought, well, I'm my own best experiment. If I screw up, I only have myself to blame. And eventually I did actually figure out how to correct and rebalance my skin issues so that I no longer have eczema at all. I haven't had it in probably well over a year and a half. And so I started the website Skinterrupt and the Healthy Skin Show podcast in order to share the information that people aren't telling the patients who are stuck in these chronic skin rash conditions, and all the other options out there aside from those like 4 creams and maybe some biologics and immunosuppressants and such.
Yeah. So what do you think are some of the underlying root causes of skin rashes? What are some of the most common triggers?
Well, the first thing I will tell you is absolutely gut issues. And
Okay.
I'm sure like for anybody listening to this who's a practitioner who's like in the functional integrative realm, you're like, duh, sure. Yeah, of course, Jen. You're not sharing anything that isn't obvious. But here's the thing. What a lot of people discount is that you have to balance your digestion and absorption with what's going on with the microbiome. Both are equally important. And you can't just do digestive enzymes and be like, oh, that'll take care of the problem. You have to look and make sure that the person has enough stomach acid, that they have a gallbladder. Is there too much inflammation, for example, where there is such a thing where we see that when somebody's gut is very inflamed, their body has a hard time absorbing fats. And we know that the cellular membrane is made up of lipids. And so if you're not able to absorb lipids, especially like vitamin A is vital for the skin, the thyroid, your eyes, your eyesight, you have a real problem. So again, you got to balance that with what's going on with the microbiome. We can certainly talk about that in a little while, because dysbiosis and infections are both two problems, as well as the amount of acidity in the colon, which I'm sure we can talk about too. I'd also say hormones. Thyroid is really important. You can have genetic factors that can predispose you to having certain skin conditions, specifically those with more of an autoimmune slant, so like psoriasis, vitiligo, scleroderma. However, with eczema, it's a little trickier. There's a lot more factors involved in it, unfortunately, than some of the other conditions, because sometimes we can have things where you've got like more histamine dominant. So you're looking at environmental allergens, environmental triggers, food allergies, food sensitivities, but I consider those a symptom. Your thyroid has to be balanced. I will say that. The other piece to this is drug triggers. So you have to also do you have to actually ask people what drugs they've taken in the past, because believe it or not, the research that I've done shows that there are increasing number of drugs that are prescribed by doctors, like atenolol, for example, that can trigger skin rashes. Like one of the atenolol, for example, can actually trigger psoriasis. There's also psoriasis drugs that can trigger psoriasis flares, which doesn't make any sense whatsoever.
Wow.
And so those are some of the key pieces that you could be looking at: heavy metal toxicity, liver detoxification challenges, trauma as in, maybe you experienced something like your father passed away suddenly when you were a child, or you were in a horrific car accident, or like I lived in New York City when 9/11 happened. That was a terrible thing. So, or it could be small traumas, like you go to work every day and your boss is incredibly abusive. So there's a whole litany. I consider it to be about 16 different root causes, but those are probably the most common that I see.
Which psoriasis drugs trigger psoriasis flares?
Oh, I have to look that up for you. I got an article for you on that.
I'm sorry. I didn't mean to put you on the spot.
No, that's okay. It's a good question.
But
I don't know offhand. I just don't remember offhand.
That's
but
okay.
We can certainly share that if you want to share that in your show notes.
Yeah, sounds good. You can email me that. So
Absolutely.
What's your take on food sensitivities triggering skin rashes?
Oh, so food sensitivities, I don't consider to be a root cause, as I was saying. I consider them to be a symptom. And this is an important distinction that I think has gotten very muddied in functional medicine. We fixate so much on taking foods out. And so you have to remember, when people have chronic skin problems, They come out of the dermatologist. The first thing they do is go, well, the dermatologist hasn't told me everything. Maybe it's something in my diet. And so they start reading online and they see all this information. There is something called the eczema diet. There's also something called the psoriasis diet. And they'll begin seeing, as they join Facebook groups, people who've taken out increasing number of foods. And what happens is they end up on a smaller and smaller diet. They oftentimes don't feel better. And a lot of times people who do things like the eczema diet or the psoriasis diet sometimes will get better, but then cannot add those foods back in without triggering flares. And it becomes an incredibly frustrating state. So my thing is like, hey, you know, food doesn't cause leakiness throughout the gut. It really doesn't. Gluten is the only protein that has been clinically proven through studies to have that capacity. So we can't blame all foods. You can't blame eggs. You can't blame dairy. You can't blame all these other food groups that we keep telling people, oh, you should avoid them because they're bad for you. I'm not saying that everyone should eat all of these things or that they're going to work for everybody. But the thing is, they're not the reason that the gut ultimately became leaky to the point where it can no longer find its sense of tolerance again. It's lost that tolerance for those gut junctions to be closely sealed. And so the thing, from having done so many interviews and talked to so many microbiome experts, it's really a state of are we digesting our food? Are we absorbing it? Because that impacts the microbiome. So what then is the state of the microbiome? Do we have infections present? Do we have, say, too much E. coli, even though it's an opportunistic bacteria and should be there, or Candida, which it's an opportunistic yeast, and it should be there to some degree in the gut, but is it in too much of a quantity?
Yes.
And that's where usually, I mean, stress certainly plays a role, NSAIDs can play a role, but we're so fixated on food, we don't realize that as practitioners, what we do is we make people afraid of food. And they get to a point where they're thinking that the entire reason they're sick is just because of food. And they spend years on this increasingly shrinking diet that causes them to become malnourished and feel worse and worse and worse. And so that's why I think food sensitivities are important to identify, but we can't rely on an elimination diet to be like the number one tool of functional medicine. It thoroughly confuses me because all of the clients that I see with chronic skin conditions have done all of these, like sugar-free, dairy-free, egg-free, salicylate-free, nightshade-free, and they're not any better.
Well, I think where it comes from is somebody like yourself who's maybe seeing the really advanced cases, you know, once the patients go down this chronic gut road and, you know, they've layered one diet on top of the next, FODMAP diet and the no histamine diet and the no this diet and you know, there's nothing left to eat and then they're afraid to eat anything. So for those patients, it's definitely not a good idea to start talking about eliminating any foods. But then you do have some of these patients who don't really have any gut problems and are coming to you for something else and then they get a skin rash and you take out one or two common foods, you take out gluten and it's gone and they eat it again and it comes back. So we know there's some relationship, but
absolutely. I'm not saying there's none. And actually the one thing that I do ask people, regardless of what their gut circumstance is, I do ask them to take gluten out because of that increased leakiness. However, I will share this. And I don't know, you know, how many people listening to your podcast are practitioners, but pretty much every single chronic skin client, so they've got eczema, psoriasis, whatever, those who have no gut symptoms, like literally I'm asking and I'm digging, no gut symptoms, completely fine. They poop like a champ 1 to 3 times a day, no straining, no diarrhea, no gas, no bloating, whatever. When we do a stool panel, they either have dysbiosis or they have infections. So you can't say that just because they don't have any gut symptoms that there's no problem with the microbiome. And one of the reasons why that a lot of people don't know about, this blew my mind, I learned about this last summer from Karan Krishnan, was that butyrate.
I've had him on the podcast before. He's really good.
He's a genius, man. I love talking to Karan. I always learn like 20 million things every single time. But the one thing that he had shared with me was about a bunch of studies that have been done looking at the importance of short chain fatty acids in the gut and how that communicates with the skin. And so I was like, what are we talking about here? And so I go and look it up, and lo and behold, there is some really incredible research of linking. So the acidity essentially of the colon to establishing this healthy microbiome balance, because dysbiosis of the skin is one significant problem or challenge that a lot of people with skin rashes have. And so butyrate specifically, so for those of you who are like, butyrate, well, it's a small short chain fatty acid that these bacteria, the healthy gut bugs, produce when they munch up your fiber, basically. And so butyrate's really important to help maintain that healthy microbiome balance on the skin. So if you do, say, like a GI effects, and you discover that they have low butyrate, that's a problem if that person, we already know, has dysbiosis of the skin, because they're missing this important link between the two.
Right. Yeah. It brings up the issue of fiber, which is such an important issue. And we have patients with chronic gut problems who get flared with fiber, but yet fiber is a prebiotic and can help the growth of those bacteria in their colon. And so it can be beneficial and not beneficial. And sometimes it depends on the type of fiber.
And there's also too, now there are butyrate supplements that you can try. I'm actually testing them out in some clients, and I can't speak about it extensively and say this works, but in the clients that I've tested this out with who have issues with dysbiosis of the skin, using supplemental butyrate has actually really helped them. And so I would just say, if you're not working with a practitioner, I wouldn't recommend you doing this by yourself. But if you're working with a practitioner, or you are a practitioner, it might be something to look into.
Yeah. In some conversations with some other practitioners, a lot of people seem to like this one product that has a combination of butyrate, acetate, and propionate, which are three of the short chain fatty acids. I've really been enjoying this discussion, but now I'd like to pause to tell you about the sponsor for this episode of the Rational Wellness Podcast. This episode is sponsored by Pure Encapsulations, which is one of the few lines of professional nutritional supplements that I use in my office. Pure Encapsulations manufactures a complete line of hypoallergenic, research-based dietary supplements. Pure products are meticulously formulated using pure, scientifically tested and validated ingredients. They are free from magnesium stearate, gluten, GMOs, hydrogenated fats, artificial colors, sweeteners, and preservatives. Among other things, one of the great things about Pure Encapsulations is not just the quality products, but the fact that they often provide a range of different dosages and sizes, which makes it easy to find the right product for the right patient, especially since we do a lot of testing and we figure out exactly what the patients need. So, for example, with DHEA, they offer 5, 10, and 25 milligram dosages in both 60 and 180 capsules per bottle size, which is extremely convenient. And now, back to our discussion. So in one of your blog articles, I noticed you mentioned foods that are high in nickel, which I've never heard before. And I think that I find that kind of interesting. I've had several patients where we ran like the NutriVal, and they're high in nickel, and it's like, where did I get nickel? I don't know, but
Well, yeah, there's foods, and actually a lot of them, unfortunately, are gluten-free foods.
So which foods are high in nickel?
Well, I'm going to tell you this much. I actually don't recommend the nickel-free diet. One of the reasons why is, in having done my research and actually talked with a bunch of dermatologists, Dr. Peter Leo, for example, he's been on my podcast. And
but wait a minute, wouldn't eating nickel foods help to prevent breaking the bank?
So basically, the problem is that there's such little nickel in food that for those who actually have a sensitivity to it, it sometimes just becomes too much of a challenge and not actually worth it. So while it may be something where people say, here, if you have a really extreme nickel allergy, and I mean, you've got to get tested by somebody. I think it's more than just like, oh, I wear a piece of cheap jewelry and my skin reacts to it. But in his clinical experience, because I was more on the I was kind of on the fence about whether it was even worth it to suggest it, because that's a problem. I recommend people go gluten-free, but a lot of the gluten-free grains, a lot of the gluten-free foods have some level of nickel in them. And so he just said that in his clinical practice, and he's up at Northwestern University, I believe, that they found it to be of almost no benefit to have people fixate on removing nickel foods, that they found other things to be more important in helping them. So there's a lot of other diets that can be, I think, helpful to some degree. But I think one thing that people oftentimes confuse is, like, if you have an issue with histamine, for example, like you've got a lot of itchiness and you're waking up at night, or you become incredibly itchy at night, or you're developing hives, I mean, that can be caused sometimes by infections, gut infections. It can also be issues due to cortisol elevations. We also see sometimes that people have difficulty breaking histamine down in the gut, and so they may require a DAO supplement in addition to any digestive aid that they're taking. That can sometimes help.
That's diamine oxidase.
Mm-hmm.
Yep.
Correct. And also too, limiting their diet in fermented foods and cured foods and pickled foods as well. And all types of like vinegar, and that includes vinegar. A lot of people don't realize that. They go, oh, well, I don't really eat a lot of fermented foods. I'm like, do you eat ketchup? Do you eat mustard? And they're like, oh. So that can be something that can sometimes be helpful.
Yeah.
As is like some people will also focus on low salicylate foods. But here's the thing with that. You don't have a sensitivity to salicylate foods. Your liver has difficulty processing salicylates, which is basically a naturally occurring chemical that exists in certain foods to help preserve them. It's Mother Nature's, brilliance at work, but it's just your body, for whatever reason, has difficulty. And so using something
by the way, it's the active ingredient in aspirin.
Yes, exactly. Well, that's what got me thinking. I'm like, why does everybody think they're sensitive? Because it doesn't make any sense. Salicylates are processed in the liver. It's not a gut problem, but we position them as if it is a food problem in and of itself, and it's not. And so things like glycine, B6, magnesium can all be very helpful in supporting your liver, as well as glutathione, in making sure that your liver has enough of its, I like to call them like ingredients that they require in order to do their jobs.
Right.
But specifically glycine and B6 are necessary because that's the pathway. The glycine pathway is where salicylates are processed.
Great. Interesting. In one of your articles, you talked about the difference between food allergies, food sensitivities, and food intolerances. And I think there's a lot of confusion about that. Can you help clarify that?
Yeah. So food allergies are typically described as an IgE response. You could think of the E as emergency. So like throat swelling closed, eyes are closing. Right. It's really bad. You could die. Right.
Yep.
Whereas a food sensitivity is an IgG reaction. It's a different type of immune cascade that's happening, typically not life-threatening. And it could be delayed as well. You might not experience something for a number of days. Another reason why I'm not the biggest fan of relying on extensive food sensitivity testings is sometimes they're kind of transient and they can change with time depending on what you're eating and exposed to. Whereas food intolerances are an entirely different beast. It just means that you don't have an enzyme in your system that's capable of breaking down that particular thing. Like histamines, histamine intolerance is a thing. Whereas there's no histamine sensitivity. You're missing that DAO enzyme in the gut that's necessary to break histamines down. And so it's an intolerance, like lactose intolerance. You're missing lactase, the enzyme. And so they're very different, and people like to interchange those terms, and it's very incorrect. And it's also confusing to me as a practitioner. I have to question when people say, oh, I have this allergy to this. I'm like, okay, could you describe that? Did you go to an allergist? Do you have an allergy panel? Oh, no, I had a food sensitivity test. I'm like, okay, that's not an allergy. It's a different response. And I think we as practitioners have to get a little clearer with people. And I know that it's easy because that's what they've read about, but it also is our job to make sure that they understand what's actually happening to them, not just making it super easy so we can breeze through the appointment.
Right. Good. So in one of your articles, you talk about the fact that a lot of people see coconut oil as a super healthy oil, really good for us, and people use it in cooking and people put it on their skin, but that's probably not the best idea, right?
No, as far as skin rash conditions are concerned, and so initially when I wrote the article, I was very much just focused on people with skin rashes, but I've noticed recently that we've had more and more people who were using it and then developed skin rashes as a result of using coconut oil. So this may be a heads up to those of you who don't have issues and are using coconut oil as your lotion. But there's 3 reasons why, well, 4, but just the 4th reason is basically there are way better options out there than coconut oil to be using as part of your moisturizing regimen. But basically, coconut oil is way too antimicrobial. For those who have skin rashes, you're basically wiping out everything that's on the skin. And if you're already struggling and you've got this tug of war going on the skin, and say you don't have enough butyrate in your gut to help establish that, you've got gut infections, you're wiping out everything. And then the bad guys rush back faster. So it's not a good situation on that front. Number 2, it's also too saturated. And I'm not going to get into the debate about how coconut oil is really good for us. We need, these medium chain triglycerides, blah, blah, blah. Our digestive system is much different than our skin. They're not the same thing. I know it's a part of the body, but for your skin to properly absorb those lipids, they have to be smaller. And so a lot of times people will notice that coconut oil feels like it's just laying on your skin. It's not being absorbed. And that's the reason why it is not being absorbed. The molecules are too large. And so for some people, it feels almost like the skin is being covered in saran wrap. And at times almost feels like the heat from the body is being trapped as a result of that. So that's not good. And last but not least, it's too alkaline. Your skin environment actually needs to be on the more acidic side. I know everybody loves alkalizing everything. That's like a big thing in nutrition. But the problem is that your skin's pH, to be healthy, needs to be around 4.5 to like 5.5 on the pH scale. That's acidic. And unfortunately, coconut oil is around 8. So it's much more alkaline than your skin is. And so as you apply that to what should be a more acidic environment, you're causing the pH to go up. And what happens is the pH is really important. You might think like, what does it matter? But the pH helps. It's basically one of the chemical ways that your body prevents microbes that shouldn't be there, or shouldn't be there in the quantity that they end up being there. It's a control mechanism. And when you start manipulating the pH from what it should be, you're inviting in problems. And so those are the 3 reasons why. The 4th is just basically like, if you want something that's the closest to your natural sebum, it would be jojoba. But like olive oil is a great choice. Even sunflower oil, believe it or not, there's some great research for eczema, that sunflower oil, not the cooking stuff, like the stuff that's meant for your body. Avocado, I've heard great things about, and especially testimonials from people who've given that a shot. Olive oil, avocado, jojoba, even sesame oil can be a good option. It just has a pretty strong odor that some people find a bit of a turnoff. But yeah.
Right. Interesting. So this alkaline thing, it's very common in the functional medicine world to eat a alkaline diet. There's alkaline water, and people tout a high alkaline diet as being better for hormonal balance, for cancer prevention, for all these different things. But I think, number one, people forget about the fact that our body prefers a acidic environment, especially in the stomach, especially in the large intestine, colon, where I think everybody assumes that your intestinal tract is supposed to be more alkaline. But don't forget about those acid-loving bacteria that need a somewhat acidic environment in the colon. And so I think there's a lot of hype associated with these alkaline diets. I'm not so sure that they're beneficial for the reasons people think they are. Number one, it's my take that probably the fact that they're eating more green vegetables and maybe cutting back on their grains, they're getting some benefit from it, but probably not because of the alkalinity.
Yeah, I totally agree with you. And plus, you don't want an alkali stomach. You can't
Right.
digest anything. Your stomach has to be very, very acidic in order to appropriately break proteins down, for example. So it's complete, I mean, it's just, it flies in the face of human physiology that every part of your body needs to be alkalized. That's ridiculous. And that's not science. That's not based on science.
And by the way, I think you're pissing in the wind if you think that um, drinking some alkaline water is going to suddenly turn the environment in your stomach into this alkaline
Yeah.
state anyway. So it's not.
No.
Um, you were talking about the microbiome of the skin. It's interesting. Is there any way to assess the microbiome of the skin? Is there like,
I wish. I really wish
right,
there
that you
was
could
one
just take
test.
a skin,
I know. There's
test and send it in like you get a stool sample? That would be cool.
Yeah, there was one test that I found that they did that, but I don't think it's actually being utilized anymore. I know that a lot of companies, big companies, pharmaceutical and skincare companies are really diving in full steam ahead into the more like probiotic microbiome realm. So we are going to see more and more products coming out that actually have that have the microbiome in mind. There's actually a sensor, I believe, that I can't remember whether it's L'Oreal or who is making this sensor that you would wear on your arm. I think it's a patch, and it'll tell you what the pH of your skin is. There's a lot of creams now that have probiotics infused into them. How well they work is questionable. A lot of people also want to believe, and this is the other piece. I mean, I love products like Mother Dirt. It's nice because it's helping to replace some of the microbiome, the good bugs that help establish that healthy balance. But the thing is, if you've got really bad rashes, it's probably not just one thing, like one cream. You're not one cream away from being fixed. I
Right.
think, unfortunately, that's the mentality, and it's not. And here's the other piece. The microbiome on your skin actually varies upon location. So what's going on, the front of your thighs is very different from what's going on in the armpit. And so there's different regions and it varies. But some things that are interesting is that, you can apply probiotics topically. I've had really good luck with Megaspore, for example, and you apply some of your olive oil, not coconut oil, to that area, and then sprinkle lightly some Megaspore on, and let it sit for a couple of hours. I wouldn't do this during the day when you're at work. Probably wait until you get home, and that can help rebalance the skin microbiome. I've also had some great luck with people just saying that they've taken like a swab from, say, their cheek or someplace that has no rash whatsoever, and then dabbing it into the areas where there is an issue. And again, applying the oil and whatnot. And they've had some luck with that. So those are two things that can be helpful. But again, if you've got a lot of stuff internally that's out of balance, that might help some. But again, you're not one step away from getting your skin rashes figured out if you've had them for a long time, unfortunately. I wish it was simple. And this is the thing with the gut world and the chronic health world. We're like, oh, if you just take this one supplement, if you just do this protein powder, if you just do this, you're going to be better. You're going to have all this energy. And we're super hypey about it. But with skin, it's so complicated because the skin is the lowest on the totem pole and nobody tells you that. And so for me, the thing I felt I didn't actually tell you in the beginning, it took 6 months of consistently taking action on the protocol that I built for myself in order to stop just the flares. I still had rashes. I still had cracked, dry skin. My nails were all messed up. And it took another 6 months to finally get the rashes to stop. I still had dry skin that cracked. I still had messed up nails. It took another almost 3 to 6 months to finally see then that the skin evened out and the nails were pretty close to being back to normal. It takes time because the rest of the body needs attention before the skin, unfortunately. And I think when we don't appropriately provide people that the expectation of what's ahead, it is a long journey, especially if you decide to go the natural route. It's a scenic route. Think of it as taking a scenic route. It's going to take a while, and you have to be mentally prepared for that journey. You're not going to like get better in a month. If you do, I'm happy for you, but that's not most people's experience.
Do we know about which organisms are present on the skin are they similar to the bacteria that are present in the colon?
There is a little bit of a similarity, but the bacteria on the skin are actually lipid loving, which is different from what goes on in the colon. So they call the microbiome on the skin a lipidome. And so they actually consume fats. So for most skin conditions, they do, you're okay, you're good with using oils. The only one that I know of, and I mean, I'm not necessarily an expert in every single chronic skin condition, but if you do have perioral dermatitis, where it affects right around the mouth, oil is usually not a good thing to apply to your rashes. I don't know why. It's one of the most frustrating, difficult conditions to work with, unfortunately.
Good. So I just came back from the SIBO, Integrative SIBO conference in Seattle this past weekend. And a condition I often see in my practice is small intestinal bacterial overgrowth, which is the underlying cause of irritable bowel syndrome in quite a number of cases. And can you talk about how this can be related to skin conditions?
Absolutely. So one of the really interesting things that I had been reading up on, it's gut. So right there, you know that if we've got SIBO, for example, that's a problem. However, there's a really interesting connection to rosacea that a lot of people don't realize. And what's fascinating to me is there was an incredible study done back in 2013 by Dr. Weinstock, who discussed and looked into this because he's a GI doctor, and he started to notice this interesting correlation between both ocular and skin rosacea and what was going on with the use of rifaximin in treating the SIBO. And that he would, once they did that treatment, a lot of times the rosacea would clear up. And it's staggering to me to think, after all this time, they're coming out with more and more rosacea products, more and more. And yet, why is this research that's been out there for a while? I mean, it's 6 years. Why isn't that something that's used in clinical practice? I mean, I can't even tell you how many times I've said, go back to your dermatologist, talk to your dermatologist about doing these tests. The dermatologists don't want to do any tests. They say that's not their responsibility, that you have to go see your primary care doctor. And I'm like, you know, you are a doctor too. You're allowed to run labs. I'm confused. So they don't see anything. I tell you,
it doesn't fit into the model. You know, especially since everything's, dictated by the insurance companies. The conventional docs are limited to short office visits. Mm-hmm. They're going to go out and start testing your gut, and these tests are really complicated to understand and to interpret. And then you have to put people on complicated protocols, and then it takes a period of time, and they have to watch your diet, and it just does not fit into the model.
No, not at all. It's really sad. Even my father, who's an ophthalmologist, he's in his 70s. He was like, I was like, Dad, did you see this stuff? Have you ever heard of this? Like ocular rosacea and SIBO? He's like, what's SIBO? So I explained it to him, and he was like, can you send me that? That sounds fascinating, because apparently ocular rosacea tends, if you do have rosacea and you end up with ocular rosacea, usually the ocular form will show up first before it results on the skin. At least that's from my understanding. And so I just think it's a shame that we're not, we talk about all the research being done, but I think people are only looking at certain areas, and we don't realize that medicine is evolving, but the way that it's being handled and done is really only evolving at the pace of drug companies. Because now on the TV, you see all these ads for Dupixent, which is a biologic drug for eczema. And that's considered, I read an article, it's considered to be one of their next blockbuster drugs because of how much money it's going to make them. And all it does is suppress the inflammatory, one of the inflammatory pathways. And that's it.
This, unfortunately, is a story of why so many of the drugs that have come out for a lot of chronic conditions, just look at the Alzheimer's research, they're trying to find the one pathway and a drug that blocks that one pathway, and that's the end of the story. And unfortunately, there's many pathways you have to look at a number of things and address a number of these if you're really going to get success. But that's just not part of the model. And
No.
so that's what's going on with the skin too. They want to find this one inflammatory pathway. How do we block that one pathway with this one particular product that blocks it? And you know, that's what fits into their model.
Well, and I'll say this much to anybody who's listening, who's like, wait, I'm on one of those drugs, or I'm considering one of those. I'm non-dogmatic. Listen, you have to make the decision within your values and what's going on in your life and where you are with things about what your choices are, because it's your choice in the end. But I personally think that you as a patient, you as a steward and caretaker of the one body that you have in this life, you should do your research. You should decide if that 2% or 1% risk is worth it for you, because there are risks of cancer. There are very serious complications that can occur, and you can have bad reactions to those drugs. I have worked with people who have had bad reactions to them. And so you shouldn't assume it will never be you. But at the end of the day, I don't think you should throw the baby out with the bathwater and say that all pharmaceutical drugs are necessarily bad. There's a time and a place for everything. But I think you as the patient, again, that steward type position, you have to do your research and be comfortable with the decision that you're making. Go in with your eyes wide open and know what the potential issues and hiccups could be. And especially too, the thing that's nice is if you combine complementary and the conventional together, you know, I still use steroids when I was going through my journey. I had to use topical steroids. I had to keep the, I mean, I couldn't even touch a stinking knob on the door. I couldn't open the door. I mean, you know, like I had to do what I had to do to like get through daily life. But in the meantime, I was working on all the other stuff under the surface. And so you can find a way forward that meets your needs and values. And I just want to encourage people to know that it's okay, and you should never feel bad or ashamed for whatever your decision is, but just own it and make it with eyes wide open.
Yeah, no, and I want to clarify, I'm not trying to bash pharmaceutical companies for trying to help people with medications, and I don't want to tell people to stop taking their medications, especially if they've been helping them, but they need to understand that there's underlying reasons for these conditions, and simply blocking the immune response long-term is not going to be the best answer.
Absolutely. And, you know, that's why I said, like, go to the simple things. Look at, you know, the first thing to do, no matter where you are in your journey, I would say the first thing I ask people to do, honestly, is to check their stomach acid level. Because if you're not able to properly digest your proteins, number one, for example, B12, which is a really important nutrient, is actually connected in food to proteins. So if you don't have enough stomach acid, you're never going to break that apart, number one. Number two, if the proteins aren't broken down into their smallest little building blocks, I like to think of it as like Legos, they're not going to be able to be absorbed. So they head further downstream, they feed the gut bugs, which is not necessarily a good thing. And then you've got some very expensive poop on your hands, which nobody wants, because you want to absorb that expensive food. You don't want to be pooping it out. And you don't want to be feeding bad gut bugs either. And so I typically recommend that people check the level of stomach acid that they have, because we want an acidic stomach acid environment. We want to make sure we're producing enough stomach acid. And it's a really simple and easy test to be able to do that. You're basically just combining some water and baking soda. And I mean, I don't know if you are open to sharing the resource that I have. It's just a really simple direction of how to actually do that test at home. It doesn't cost anything, and it'll give people
Is this a test where you start taking hydrochloric acid tablet?
No, you actually just mix baking soda and water.
Yeah, and then what?
You wait to burp.
Oh.
About 10 to 15 minutes. It's really simple. And the thing that's nice is that the hydrochloric acid, that makes me uncomfortable, because
challenge test.
Yeah, it just makes me uncomfortable. I've had really good luck correlating this with actually doing like a GIFX and also taking a look at the products of protein breakdown and whatnot. You can really see that there is some great correlation. Even if you don't have GERD or any heartburn issues, a lot of times people who've been chronically ill don't have enough stomach acid. And just that alone can really start to alleviate some of the issues immediately, because if you're feeding the gut bugs that you don't want to be feeding, that's not a good situation.
Right.
So we start to right the ship. And obviously if you discover, so basically you want to burp. You want like a big, big belch. Like when you're a kid, you drink a lot of soda. And if you're not belching or you have the little tiny little burps, that basically means that you don't have enough stomach acid present. And so then the next thing to consider is like, do you have a gallbladder? If you don't, you really need to supplement ox bile for the rest of your life. And that's before every single meal. And then consider, I like to do usually a full spectrum digestive aid. So it'll typically be betaine HCl, ox bile, and digestive enzymes. That way we're making sure that all pieces are supported. Because if you're really not well, let's try and do our best to help your body. Let's make it easy. But again, it's just a really simple, easy kind of free thing to do and get some answers quickly.
That's great. What's your resource for patients to go to your website and find out about the stomach acid test?
I will be honest with you, the link's a little tricky. I can certainly give it to you to make sure that you have it. If you want to put
you know what? We'll just put it in the show notes.
Yeah, that'll make it super easy for people because the link is, I don't think anyone would get it from me. They'd be like, what?
There's so many things we can talk about. I'd like to hit on one more thing.
Sure.
I know you've talked about thyroid and the connection with skin. So can we talk about that for a few minutes?
Absolutely.
Give me everything you know in the next 3 minutes. No.
I would say this. You should make sure that your thyroid is optimized, the function is optimized, because we know for sure that in people who have hypothyroidism and Hashimoto's, a lot of times some people don't realize that Hashimoto's is a low thyroid state.
Yes.
That chronic dry skin is one of the symptoms. And one of the reasons why is that, thyroid hormone helps tell your cells what to do, how fast to go. It's part of your whole system of homeostasis. And so when you don't have enough appropriate thyroid hormone, the cells don't turn over as quickly. It also, from what I understand in talking to a lot of thyroid experts, it causes there to be a poor circulation out to the cells of the skin. And so we're seeing less removal of waste as a result, and you're seeing less nutrients getting out to those cells. And so optimizing your thyroid and making sure that you're seeing optimal levels of T3, T4, TSH, that the reverse T3 level is in balance with T3. And those, I'll just say this too, always make sure that your T3, T4 you're looking at the free values, though that is important. And that you're also making sure that there are no antibodies, or that you're slowly with time seeing an improvement in antibody load if you do have Hashimoto's, for example. But that's a really important part to the piece. And again, vitamin A, I can't talk, pretty much everybody that I talk to and that I work with has low vitamin A, and low vitamin A is really important to improve, because your thyroid needs it, your skin needs it, your eyes need it. So I think there's just some very basic things that we should look at. That way we can just make sure to support the body as a whole.
That's great. Thank you so much for providing us with a lot of interesting information about the skin and what we can do to improve our skin. How can listeners find out about you and the things that you have to offer?
So you can visit me over at skinterrupt.com. So it's basically the word skin and interrupt slammed together. And then basically also if you love...
Can you spell that out?
SKINTERRUPT. There we go. And I know it's a little tricky. That's why I say it's skin and interrupt slammed together. If you certainly search my name, it'll come up very easily. You can also check out the healthyskinshow.com, and that'll bring you to my podcast, which we're on most of the podcasting platforms. And it's a twice a week podcast where we're delving into all the different areas of chronic skin conditions. I also have inspirational stories and looking at research. We even answer listener questions. So it's a great resource for people. Those are really the two spots you can find me. And then I'm on Instagram. So I do a lot of stuff on Instagram too.
Wow. Twice a week podcast.
Yes.
And how hard a once a week podcast is. So that's great that you're able to do that. Okay. Thank you, Jennifer.
Thank you for having me. I really appreciate it.